In 1915, an unremarkable family with an unremarkable background settled down in Chicago, Illinois. Louis Francis, a native of Bavaria, had married Rose Ellen Foley, a New Yorker of Irish descent, a few years prior. Louis made a living as a stockbroker, while Rose had a degree in music and was an accomplished pianist. Their first two children, Vinette and James, were born in Europe, with their third child, Alice, being born shortly after their arrival. Their fourth and final child would be born on September 18th of 1917. As is the case with many families, they anglicized their last name upon their arrival, morphing into a phonetic representation of its German pronunciation, Yockey. That final child's name was Francis Parker. Francis Parker Yockey started his life fairly simply, as is the case with most, literal children. With a firmly upper-middle-class upbringing, very few signs in his youth pointed to his future of inventing racism too and becoming America's first gamer president. It's implied that his mother held some degree of right-wing sentiments, but nothing major or particularly out of the ordinary for the time. By all accounts, he was incredibly intelligent, breezing through grade school and picking up piano from his mother at a very young age, becoming extremely proficient in it. Tragically, he would get into a car accident in the late 20s or early 30s, I don't know, it's not specific, that damaged his hand to the point that his hopes of becoming a concert pianist died instantaneously. In 1932, the family would move to Ludington in Michigan. He had the brains to get into basically any college he wanted, and this showed with him jumping around a lot for a decade. His original plan was med school, which he started and then stopped, likely because of that fucked up hand. He began at U of Michigan, then spent a year at U of Chicago, another 2 years at Georgetown University, then fucking off across the country to finish his undergrad at U of Arizona. He settled on law school after this, first attending Northwestern University, then DePaul University, then finishing his law degree at Notre Dame University in 1941. Oh, to have grown up in a time without asinine tuition. He would crush the bar exam with little difficulty because, as I said, he was a smart cookie, and he began his legal career on the circuit court in Mason County, Michigan in late 1941. He was also a bit of a shitposter, and he was known for playing communist songs on the piano at Michigan U, one time at a party hosted by the dean of the university. He got in shit. I wonder why. He likely wasn't actually a communist, he just tended to piss people off because he found it funny. Anyways, he showed his drift very early on, gradually becoming more and more attracted to the world of the extreme right. Where he differs from many of his contemporaries is that he didn't really give a fuck about politics, preferring to take the role of the ideologue and the theorist. His first real introduction to the broader world of the extreme right came in 1938, when his essay, The Tragedy of Youth, was published in Father Charles Coughlin's magazine Social Justice. It was quite traditional writing by rightist standards, very anti-communist, pro-Germany, anti-war, etc. He also leaned heavily into Catholic social doctrine, and many of the themes he discusses are prototype forms of ideas that he will elaborate on later in his life. He continued in 1939, speaking at a Silver Legion rally and working pretty closely with the German-American Bund. He was apparently regarded as a good speaker amongst the American right, although in the future he would largely disavow public speaking outside of gatherings in the United States. In 1940, he wrote another essay, this one called Life as an Art. This essay was honestly a beta version of his later work, touching on ideas of how Western culture was in its terminal stage, certain enemies were strangling it, and the solution was an empire. This would be the showcase of the heavy influence a certain Oswald Spengler would have on him. The overarching theme of that particular fellow was the absolute state of the West, along with rather unique interpretations of culture as an organism and history as playing out in cycles. I won't go into extreme detail about him because, let's be real, Yockey is just Spengler, but comically racist. If you can wrap your head around Yockey's ideas, you sure as shit can understand Spengler. Just note that Spengler is important in the develop of Yockey's beliefs. He comes up a lot later. In 1942, he joined the US Army, which may be surprising considering the anti-war thing I mentioned about a paragraph ago. However, he almost immediately went AWOL that same year to help out a bunch of German spies that had landed in the country. All of the spies got arrested though, so he returned to his unit and then either faked a mental illness, or actually developed one, to get booted in 1943. He would specifically be diagnosed with the dementia praecox paranoid type, which is the old medical term for paranoid schizophrenia. Make a note of this fact because it will come back to bite him in the ass in, 17 years? Remember kids, the feds don't forget. Speaking of feds, the FBI had him on their radar off the rip. He was engaging in a little too much gleeful mischief for them to not at least give him a look. They figured he was a spy and probably a subversive element, but they couldn't really do anything at the moment because they had bigger fish to fry. Also in 1943, he would get married to one Alice McFarlane, with whom he would have 2 kids before getting separated in 1946. During this time, he would find work at several law practices throughout Michigan, where he would be noted as having pro-German sympathies by colleagues of his. Despite this very obvious issue with partiality, after the big war ended, he was put on the payroll as an attorney for the Nuremberg trials. For the entire year of 1946, he served under the U.S. War Department in Wiesbaden, dealing with lower-ranking Nazis on trial for war crimes and other such things. As you may expect, he did everything in his power to get them off the hook. He made no effort to be discreet about this. His primary motive here was to build connections in post-war Germany and fuck up the Allied legal proceedings to the best of his ability. His efforts were largely in vain, el bozo. He also made an effort to learn German while he was here, and he would become nearly fluent by the 1950s. Oh, right, he also basically invented Holocaust denialism, which is just... yeah. In November of 46, he lost his job. Surprisingly, not because he was helping the fucking Nazis, but rather because he continued to just leave every now and then to meet some Nazi figures or gallivant around Europe. By now, the FBI had him on their naughty person list because they did actually care about him helping literal fucking Nazis, and they started assembling a file on the guy that would grow to be incredibly large. They couldn't make any moves just yet, but their time will come. Despite this intrigue, he would remain in the army in some capacity until 1951, stationed in Germany as part of the Red Cross, putting that, 1 year of med school to good use. After his sacking and his separation, he decided to go on a mental health journey, a spiritual detox, if you will, to fucking Ireland of all places. I suppose it beats, backpacking through Afghanistan, but he had his bubble tea and his off-white wool sweater, so he was chillin'. In 1947, he arrived in British Bay, sat his ass down in an isolated cottage, and began to write. It would be all of his thoughts about the state of things bound up in one neat little book. His essays and his encounters with other rightist figures in the past would all coalesce. Under the pseudonym Ulrich Varang, in just 6 months, without notes, he would produce a remarkable piece of human productivity. This was, of course, Imperium, the philosophy and history of politics. Imperium is a monolithic text. It's 600 fucking pages and can come across as quite confusing. He also talks like the Skaven at some points, which I find kinda funny. Anyways, for the people who have places to be, I'll TLDR it real quick, then for the people who still have an attention span in this day and age, I am aware of the hypocrisy, I'll go into more depth. The SparkNotes version conveys a couple essential ideas about history and culture. High cultures, or supercultures, act like an organism in their function. These high cultures exist in a historical cycle of rise, golden age, stagnation, and fall. Yockey posits that the Western/European high culture is in its fall stage, brought on by materialism and rationalism, and worsened by a malicious campaign conducted by culture-distorting forces. The only way to save the West, in his eyes, is to unify it under a single, centralized authoritarian superstate which could revitalize Western culture and bring it back from the brink. The titular Imperium, if you will. The entire text is written from a radically anti-materialist and anti-rationalist perspective. The rule of money is cringe, Darwinism is cringe, communism is cringe, the Enlightenment was cringe, basically everything that happened after the French Revolution was a mistake that is causing the downfall of the West. Reject modernity, embrace tradition. Also, the term Judeo-capitalist communism is used unironically, which is funny. That's the summary of the summary, trust me, but if that's all you're here for, then you can skip ahead if I remember to timestamp. Let's be real, I probably didn't. That being said, it did take me 3 fucking hours to write this next part, so I would greatly appreciate it if you did watch it through, but ultimately it's your decision. I will also note that this is my understanding and interpretation of Yockey's beliefs. I have the mental capabilities of a particularly well-read goldfish, so it will likely differ from yours, and I apologize in advance if I am totally wrong here. Anyways, buckle the fuck up because we are going for a ride. First things first, what even is a high culture? It sounds complicated, but it really isn't. From a Spenglerian point of view, culture is the highest form of life. A high culture is a sort of spiritual union of individual cultures held together by the forces of history that they all share. These supercultures, in turn, represent the collective identity, values, and artistic expression of all that fall under its roof. Europe, or the Western superculture, is argued as the most recent of these supercultures to reach this level of maturity. It will be commonly described as an organism, which is a very good metaphor metaphor, so I am going to steal it because I lack creativity. Imagine a superculture like a person. A person is made up of many constituent organs and cells, each individually different in size, shape, and function, but all required to make the larger organism actually work. These organs and cells, in turn, are made up of even smaller structures that each have their own place in the whole. As humans get older, they accumulate more knowledge and experiences, completing whatever tasks they set out to do, and undergoing a natural cycle of birth, life, and death. Cultures function the same way. They act as a living, breathing thing that grows and evolves through the march of history. It lives, creates, and dies as any other organism would, and the individual peoples that compose this culture give it strength through their actions and spirit. In this way, culture almost becomes an idea, a mythical force that ties people together and imbues people with the spirit of the age. Now that we know what a high culture actually is, what exactly is Western culture? Or, I guess the better way to put this is, who falls under the Western category? This is where it gets a little complicated, but the easiest way to describe it is as anyone who possesses the Western soul. This will make more sense in a minute. But generally, in the most traditional terms, the West is Europe, sans Russia, and all those in the Americas and the far-flung reaches of the world who identify with the Western supercultural organism. You can be Polish, English, Greek, Swedish, Australian, Canadian, etc., but as long as you possess the spirit, soul, and ideals of the West, then you have a place in that culture. In Yockey's eyes, Europe remains the true fatherland regardless of physical distance. In this sense, your mother culture is almost a state of being rather than a literal, quantifiable thing. But wait, I hear you ask, what is the spirit of the West? Just weren't gonna bring that up? You fucking suck. Shut up, I'm getting to it. It's a bit odd to describe. The spirit of a culture is a set of broad, almost esoteric ideals that a culture has historically upheld. In the case of the West, this is represented by concepts like duty, authority, anti-materialism, collective effort, and strength of will. It also generally manifests as an inherent drive towards conquest and imperialism. The term zeitgeist is applicable here, and what one would consider symbolic of a given culture during a given time period will generally tend to define a culture's spirit. This spirit is instinctual, and in theory, any true son of the West would understand these concepts fully without even needing to have an intellectual grasp of them. This spirit also comes with an almost fatalistic idea of people having missions that the forces of history and culture guide them towards. In theory, every man and woman on Earth has an ingrained and impulsive drive towards their destiny, so to speak, and more often than not, this destiny manifests as assisting in the life of their higher culture. If anything, think of it as the ideals that the members of a culture are theoretically supposed to strive towards with all of their strength. Alright, with the technical stuff out of the way, we can get to the wacky shit that y'all are actually here for. I think it's important to talk about Yockey's views on race, because he makes a point to bring it up. For starters, Yockey believed that race and culture are fundamentally different but related concepts. The traditional idea of race generally revolves around things like skin color, skull measurements, hair and eye color, and other pedantic shit like that. Yockey instead viewed race as a wholly subjective idea representing the baser instincts of a person and the groups that they belong to. Your race is essentially a marker of your strength of will and ability to hear destiny's call, so to speak. It relates much more to the concept of spirit that I talked about earlier than it does to physical characteristics. True race is tied to the land, not genetics, and one's race represents their place in the flow of history. And much like culture, it is subject to change and growth throughout history. As race represents the spiritual characteristics of a people, and these characteristics change over time, one can say that the races of today are far different from the races of the past. For these reasons, it is not necessarily meant to be categorized because true race only exists in the realm of the spiritual. Trying to separate people on the basis of skin color is utterly pointless, as in the grand scheme of things, race as a biological concept is irrelevant compared to race as a spiritual and historical phenomenon. This belief manifests through vertical and horizontal race. Vertical race refers to your traditional adjective supremacist's view, i.e. one Superman people on top, then everyone else in kind of a pyramid. It is a purely anatomical byproduct of rationalism attempting to brute force unnatural order upon the concept of race. Yockey ascribed to horizontal race instead, which is much less scientific. Basically, instead of people belonging to a race, you instead either have race or don't. The world is divided into those whose race allows them to act in accordance to their cultural destiny and those who can't. It is essentially a belief in racial parity. All those who have race are relatively equal, and all those who don't are not. Simple as. This is one of the places where he ran fundamentally counter to the Nazis, who were decided vertical race believers. He didn't care care at all for the Nordic Aryan superiority thing. A Swede, a Spaniard, and a Romanian are all a part of the Western superculture as equals, so long as they possess the proper racial imperative. Of course, this does not mean he wasn't racist, although I guess cultureist would be the best way to describe it. While he didn't believe in the traditional racial superiority stuff, he sure as shit did believe in the spiritual racial superiority. As the West is the most recent superculture to exist, the Western racial outlook is, in theory, one of strength. Everyone else doesn't possess the proper racial and cultural spirits, which makes all of them spiritually inferior by default. I swear to fucking God, YouTube, this is not what I believe. I am simply restating the beliefs of another person. He believed that certain cultures are so inherently different, and that the West was on such a higher level, so to speak, that all others aren't really even worth talking about. This was not because they were objectively racially inferior, but because they are subjectively inferior. Since many represent long-dead supercultures, their racial imperatives are weakened. Their mission has been fulfilled, so they slipped into an almost sedated state. Gone is the racial will to power, replaced by simply existing. They are spiritually inferior because their time has passed, and the light is gone from their eyes. It has nothing to do with arbitrary traits. In fact, the insurgence of biological and scientific race thinking is a symptom of a dying race. Clinging to desperate explanations for superiority shows weakness and complacency. This is one of the West's main problems, a lack of willpower to achieve its destiny, replaced by stagnation and mediocrity. There are other interesting ideas here, too. Since culture and race are more a mindset than anything, people of foreign race and culture can integrate into a new one if they cast off the old and do everything they can to embrace their new home. If, say, a Jew chooses to wholeheartedly embrace the Western mindset, then he shall become as European as anyone else, and will earn a place within the society. This process can also be reversed. If a Westerner decides to embrace Jewish culture completely, then he becomes Jewish. No bloodline purity bullshit needed. If it can make itself look like a duck and quack like a duck, then it's a fucking duck. However, according to Yockey, these situations are few and far between and can only work in very small numbers. Better to keep the foreign cultures out and not even try. This is where the idea of culture pathology comes in. Like any organism, culture can be subject to disease. Of course, because this is Yockey we're talking about, these diseases take the form of foreign actors. As a culture ages, its immune system gradually weakens. This opens it up to pathogens worming their way in, a thing Yockey called cultural parasitism. Individuals of foreign cultures entering the realm of another to do their own thing. Another life form living in the bloodstream of the organism. Other than the obvious leeching nature of this arrangement, this on its own is not a huge problem. The issue arises when these foreign actors start to take things over. They assume positions of power, make names for themselves, and eventually start to destabilize the local cultural organism since they either can't or refuse to efficiently integrate. This is called culture distortion. The final stage is when these actors use their new power to actively subvert local culture and do their best to undermine it and speed up its demise. This is called culture retardation. As you can guess, the main culprits of this were the same group that gets harped on by literally fucking everyone. It's the Jews, go fucking figure. Why can't it be anyone interesting for once? All of the things that were working to destroy the West were run by Jews, including both capitalism and communism. Ironically though, he did think that the Jews were a fairly strong and healthy culture. Their imperative just so happened to be screwing over the West. The Jews, along with anyone who opposed the natural destiny of the West, were considered the inner enemy, and Yockey believed that they were far more dangerous than any foreign invader. Taking absolutely all of this into account, I will simply say, when I said he invented racism too, I was being quite fucking literal. The final aspect of supercultural organisms that is a central focus of Spengler and Yockey is that cultures exist in a cyclical interpretation of history. Essentially, history is defined by these supercultures. They all develop separately and at different speeds, but all of them follow an identical cycle of birth, life, and death. Continuing with the organism analogy, the life cycles of cultures can be divided into epochs, or ages, with each representing both quantifiable time periods and different cultural spirits. Certain events can be pointed to as being directly responsible for the arrival of a new stage of the cultural life cycle. And for each stage, a new cultural spirit takes over until it too is replaced. At the earliest stages of a culture's life, it is young and fiery, like a toddler. It exists to find its place in the world and cause as much damage as possible, while it grows and evolves. As a culture matures, it becomes its own distinct entity, going through golden ages of art and architecture and becoming a hegemonic force, as all within are subject to the spirit of their culture driving them forward. However, as cultures rise, so too must they fall. Eventually, Ultimately, a high culture reaches its peak of artistic, aesthetic, and martial development and stagnates, eventually growing old and slowly falling into irrelevancy. During this time, as a culture approaches its ultimate stage, it will give rise to Caesarism, great men and women who adopt the imperative of their culture and work towards its true final destiny. After this cultural mission is fulfilled, it will die peacefully and be replaced by the next high culture, so that the cycle may begin anew. The most interesting point to be made here is that the decline and death of high cultures is inevitable, and it is not necessarily meant to be forestalled. Medicine and technology may prolong the life of a person, but everyone dies eventually. That being said, Spengler and Yockey were not pessimists. With the proper spirit and will, a culture can theoretically revitalize itself. It can return to its golden age through extreme force, but it won't produce anything new. Once it hits its peak, it can stay there as long as it can, but it can only go down rather than further up. Every culture experiences this cycle, from Rome and Egypt to China and the Inca. These ideas are shared between Yockey and Spengler, however, where Yockey departs is in the field of why cultures die. As I previously explained with culture pathology, Yockey believed that the main forces of cultural decline were literal physical enemies, rather than a sort of historical inevitability. With this understanding of history through the Spenglerian lens, we can now talk about how the West fits into this cycle, and to Yockey, the answer is really not good. Basically, from Yockey's point of view, the West is screwed. The current state of Western civilization is firmly in the decline and death era. Yockey traces the cause of this to, of course, materialism and rationalism, the spirit of the previous age of the West, and the one that brought the West to its knees, poisoned by capitalist greed and commercialism, Darwinian race theories, nationalism, liberalism, democracy, and Marxist ideology. The dominance of money thinking destroyed the dutiful soul in a way. The stagnation began with the Protestant Reformation, with the traditional authority of Western culture being slowly eroded by its influence. There were glimmers of artistic hope here and there, but things slowly got worse. Western culture was essentially in its 50s at this point, slowly losing its edge and no longer being the spry, young civilization it once was. The arrival of the French Revolution was the straw that broke the camel's back. The West was struggling with health issues already, but decided to slice its own hand open and rub it around in the dirt. As previously discussed with culture pathology, this weakened state allowed for culture-distorting forces to work their way into the organism and cause disruptions. And then along came the United States, in many ways the complete anathema to Yockeyan thought, which proceeded to unplug the life support by putting Europe under its cultural thumb. He calls Hollywood cultural syphilis, which I find very funny, so I figured I'd just put that phrase out there. What's left of Western civilization is kinda like those 700-year-old fossilized politicians you see every now and then. Basically a walking corpse that serves as a meat puppet for the people actually in charge, in this case being the capitalist Americans. History demands that the West achieve its higher purpose and then succumb to its destined death, but the forces of capital and materialism refuse to let it, since there is still some corpse left to pillage. Furthermore, the West finds itself in a strange position. It is a dying state, surrounded on all sides by cultures in the earlier stages of their life cycles, all ambitious and wanting to make their marks on history, more than willing to put down the dying animal. Yockey believes that, unless something can be done, the West is fucked and may slide permanently into the pages of history. He paints a seemingly bleak picture with this interpretation. However, the decline of Western society, in his eyes, is far from a foregone conclusion. The current state of the West is artificial. The forces of materialism are keeping it in suspended animation, preventing it from achieving its final cultural stage in an organic way. This stage is Imperium, the political, social, cultural, and spiritual unity of Western civilization. Under a totalitarian, centralized organic state, he proposes that the West could be put back on track. The great supercultural organism, with all of its constituent organ cultures working in tandem, unshackled by the materialistic money economy of the past in a great unity. All subcultures, from the French and Germans to the Basque and the Sorbians, would be raised as equals, with the eradication of petty nationalism and racial hierarchies, to create a state that has all of its parts in the right order. A unity built on brotherhood, order, discipline, duty, cultural bond, and a brutal eradication of inner enemies that would return the West to its destined historical path, and possibly bring it back from the brink. Failing that, it would at least be able to die with some dignity. Yockey never believed that he would be the one to accomplish this. In his eyes, he was simply putting the idea out there. But he did genuinely believe that the way to correct the record was to bring about the unification of the West into an Imperium of Europe, a state he believed would be able to stand the test of history. Well, that was fun. Did literally any of that make sense? No? Perfect. I probably overcomplicated the shit out of that, but regardless, it's good to have an understanding of the kind of fellow we're dealing with here. Once again, my interpretation is undoubtedly flawed, but the fellow is kinda too dead to ask about it. Now, you may think that a lot of this sounds like absurdities dreamed up by the utterly deranged, and you would be absolutely right. He was batshit insane. But like I said, he was a very intelligent guy, and let's be real, being crazy and being smart are related more often than not. Well, I figured a character analysis would be good for this particular video for this exact reason. So, taking a detour from the main story, we're gonna go from the philosophical to the psychological. Francis Yockey was a divisive figure even in his time. Even disregarding his politics, the general through line is that if you met him, you either thought he was a brilliant and interesting man or a narcissistic asshole. Those who knew him best would describe him as intelligent, charming, humorous, and rather caring, especially towards his children and the children of his friends. He could hold conversations in multiple languages, was incredibly well read, especially in the classics, and tended to be the most interesting man in whatever room he was in. He was also incredibly pragmatic on matters of personal policy, and he would work with basically anyone who would give him the time of day, which would go on to include Jews, Arabs, communists, and a bunch of other trademark inner and outer enemies. As I said earlier, he was also incredibly gifted with the piano, and oftentimes when he needed work, he would find some as a piano teacher, a profession that he was actually pretty solid at. It's also implied that behind closed doors, he was a very funny guy with a great sense of humor, and he was capable of being incredibly crass at times. Completely disregarding his politics, he was human, and a reasonably stand-up one at that. Humans do, however, come with a few character flaws. For Yockey, this manifested as a complete unwillingness to acknowledge the ideas of other people as potentially valid. It was his way or the highway with very few exceptions. As a result, he would get combative when people disagreed with him, even more so if he considered the other person intellectually inferior, which was most people. Even the most minor things would get him riled up, to the point that he essentially self-sabotaged his own organization out of spite. This made it very hard for him to make friends, especially among the right. Him breaking with right-wing figures because they disagreed on things will become a very common occurrence, and this behavior made him very few allies. There is no timeline in which Yockey ever actually leads a movement because of this. He was also one of those people who molds their personality to fit whatever group they are in with at the moment. Everyone will describe him slightly differently as a result, with some having much less kind words to say than others. Many also disliked his humor, as he had a habit of shitposting at times he really shouldn't have, especially with people that he didn't like. As the 50s marched on, he also became increasingly paranoid, running around the planet with dozens of aliases to flee enemies that didn't really exist at that point. FBI doesn't have international jurisdiction after all. In general, his somewhat abrasive personality killed any popularity or momentum he could have had in the moment, largely relegating him to a footnote in most history books. He was apparently pretty good with women though, and he is implied to have been a bit of a stud. He also apparently wrote BDSM smut at one point just to make some money on the side. Yeah, I didn't know where else to put this, so I'm gonna just toss it in the middle here. His personal beliefs were also quite interesting. He called himself pagan on occasion, but all signs point to him being a practicing and fairly devout Catholic. Interestingly, he also seemed completely fine with at least the first 3 letters of this particular acronym. It wasn't overt support by any means, and outwardly he espoused the same rightist line, but in his personal life he adopted the "leave me alone and I will leave you alone" mindset. There are also some rumors that he may have been bisexual, partly for this reason, but to my knowledge these are largely unfounded. All told, like all humans, Yockey is multifaceted. An upstanding man to some and an unbearable traitor to others. Just something to keep in mind as we move on, because a lot of this info on his personality will be surprisingly relevant. Reactions to the release of Imperium and its follow-up document, the Proclamation of London, were mixed, to say the least. Yockey proved to be very divisive among the right, with many thinking he had some good ideas, many thinking he was crazy, and many simply not giving a shit. He initially aligned with the Union movement of Oswald Mosley because they had similar goals, however that fell through because Mosley was much more pro-American, which brings me to another fun point. Following the end of the war, the extreme right found themselves in a bit of a pickle. They lost very badly, and now, in order for their movements to survive, they needed to make a choice. Were they anti-American or anti-communist? The majority fit into the latter. Most rightist movements, like that of Mosley, saw their hatred of communism trump their dislike of America, and so they elected to play into the hands of the US. Others, like Otto Ernst Remmer's Socialist Reich Party, saw an alliance of convenience with the Soviet Union as the ideal path to restoring Nazism and kicking the Americans out. Yockey was firmly in the Soviet camp, but not for the reasons you may expect. In Russia, he saw a path to Europe's salvation inspiration, but it came from a slightly different place. You see, Spengler and Yockey considered the Russian culture to be Asiatic. Europe basically stops at the Baltics, and everything east is simply a part of Europe run by Asians. The Russian identity was transitory, and their destiny was in Asia. However, Russian culture was believed to be very young and violent. They are much more akin to the barbarians on the frontiers of Rome than they are to any civilized European people. Yockey saw in Russia a force that could be exploited to bring about Europe's liberation. He saw a Russian military occupation a better of two evils compared to American cultural imperialism, which is surprising considering a few things. Nevertheless, he believed that the far right should ally with the Soviet bloc. A Soviet conquest would drive out the American culture distorters and allow for a true resurgence of culture. If they conquered Europe, then he believed that one of two things would happen. Either it would inspire a mass popular revolt to genocide them out of existence and bring about European unity, or the Russian culture would be absorbed into that of Europe's, becoming another part of the organism and pushing the Imperium's frontier to the Urals. Regardless, it's a win-win and Russia always loses. Yockey also saw Soviet communism as having purged itself of Jewish influence after Stalin went a little wild, killing all the doctors and hanging 11 Jewish statesmen in Czechoslovakia for crimes they didn't even commit. Because of this perception, he spent the rest of his life trying to forge alliances with the extreme right and the communist bloc, much to the chagrin of many of his contemporaries. Anyways, Yockey initially wanted Mosley to be the leader of a pan-European movement because he himself wasn't much of a leader. He even offered to put Mosley's name on Imperium as the true author. Mosley seemingly didn't give a shit, and eventually the two had a breakup, which apparently saw Mosley break Yockey's fucking nose during an altercation. Mosley very much hated communism and wanted to align with the United States to kick them out, which was exactly the opposite of what Yockey wanted. The reactions from the rest of the right were also all over the place. Julius Evola thought that it was a neat idea, but not much more. Several German figures from World War II would endorse him, namely Otto Ernst Remmer and Hans Ulrich Rudel, and others like Basil Liddell Hart and JFC Fuller would give some support as well. More orthodox Nazis, such as Arnold Leese in the UK, really did not like the guy, clinging to the whole racial superiority thing. Leese straight up called Yockey a Jew and an agent of the communists. His biggest hater was probably George Lincoln Rockwell, who called him dangerous and thought that his ideas had created an evil cult. Pot and meat kettle. Yockey also ran afoul of Gerald L.K. Smith. He spoke at a few rallies in 1950, but afterwards determined that the American nationalist movement was basically a non-starter for the most part. Smith seemed to think similarly of Yockey, and the two simply never got along. You probably get the gist by this point, but I want to bring up one more interaction of his, because the person he got along with the best was probably Adrian motherfucking Arcand. That's right. Quebec's own fascist demagogue, who held a shocking amount of influence in the federal government, was buds with Francis Gaming Yockey. Now, Arcand deserves a video at some point, absolutely. He is simply too amusing to ignore. Yockey and Arcand genuinely seemed to be friends, and Yockey had a lot of respect for the guy. So much so that Arcand was one of the only people that Yockey would take the L from in a potential disagreement. Case in point, Arcand was the man who edited and revised the Proclamation of London, with Yockey accepting the changes that he made. He would even stay with him in Montreal whenever he visited Canada. He also believed that the Quebecois were an example of a pretty healthy culture, which is cosmically funny. Didn't really have much else to say about this, I just needed it for the Canadian representation, you know. Okay, tangent over. Point is, he was divisive. Anyways, in 1949, Yockey, together with other ex-Mosleyite figures such as Guy Chesham and Anthony Gannon, formed the European Liberation Front. It was exactly what it said on the tin, an organization dedicated to the advancement of European Imperium. Its membership peaked at around 1,000, competing with Mosley much to the detriment of both factions. They did formally merge with the MSI in Italy, but not much else really happened with the organization. It didn't have a lot of money, since sending money to fascists was kinda uncool at the time. Yockey's disagreeable personality led it to bleed membership until functionally ceasing to exist by 1955. After this shit show, Yockey turned to getting things done himself. Throughout the 1950s, he decided to travel the world. In 1952, he was definitely in the Soviet bloc, witnessing the Prague trials. He may have also worked with Czechoslovak intelligence in some capacity. In 1953, he ends up in Egypt working for Nasser writing propaganda. It's in Egypt that his pragmatism really shows. He thought very highly of the Arab nationalist movement and other figures in the Third World, primarily because of their opposition to the United States and the Zionist agenda. He was willing to put his own cultural superiority beliefs on hold if it meant the US could be mildly inconvenienced. He also worked further with Remmer, this time helping with his side hustle of questionably legal weapons dealing. In 1954, he was in Los Angeles playing piano to make some money while he was seeing a girl, before he left for Europe again. He just barely dodged the FBI here, who had caught on to one of his aliases and were in the process of hunting him down before he disappeared. Side note, he held over 24 aliases throughout the 1950s, and I am far too lazy to list them, so just understand that very few people actually knew him as Francis Yockey at this point in time. In 55, he's in Germany, and over the course of the next 2 years, he went all over Western Europe. It's also believed that he visited the Soviet Union at some point and worked with their intelligence apparatus in some capacity. If it sounds like I'm rushing here, it's because I am. It was a very chaotic time, and no one knows for certain what exactly he was doing during this period. In 1958, he moved to Nevada with a woman who was supposedly his wife, but honestly could have been completely made up. In 1959, he went to Cuba to get acquainted with the new regime there. He helped Castro hire a couple of SS officers under the table to help train their army, and again helped Otto Ernst Remmer smuggle them guns. Truly fascinating stuff. But of course, it was never destined to last. He had succeeded in keeping the FBI off his dick by changing his last name every 5 minutes and seemingly existing in 5 places at once. However, his luck could only hold out for so long. Honestly, it wasn't even his fault, but the FBI only had to get lucky once. On a flight from Washington to California, his plane had to make a stop in Dallas due to some mechanical troubles. Exact details around the following shit show are a bit sketchy, but Yockey's bag was either lost and then found by the airport staff or was pulled aside for a routine random search. Within his bag were 4 passports, all under different names. Game over. Yockey arrived in California and went to the residence of one Alexander Scharf, a fellow of notably Jewish persuasion who was letting Yockey stay with him. The FBI tracked them down and knocked on the door on June 6, 1960 to see what Scharf knew. Well, Yockey tried to book it out the back door, but one of the agents was able to grab him. Yockey proceeded to slam the agent's hand in the fucking door to try and wrench himself free, which apparently shattered the guy's hand to the point that it needed to be surgically repaired. This was enough of a distraction that the other agents were able to cut him off and arrest him. To Yockey's credit, he did apologize after realizing that he had completely fucked the guy's hand. He was tossed in jail and was set to stand trial for passport violations. The trial itself was a bit strange, all things considered. It was definitely assembled in a way to make sure that Yockey wasn't getting off. Him being booked was straight up called an issue of national security, if you were wondering. The nail in the coffin, however, was when the prosecution requested that he get a court-ordered psychological exam. I wonder what grounds they would have to request such a thing. It definitely couldn't relate to being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and getting discharged from the army in 1943. No, sir. This was all the justification they needed to have him evaluated. Now, if this were any other motherfucker, this would be totally fine. Downright normal. Psychiatric examinations on the suspected insane are generally for the best. However, Yockey was not a normal fellow. Trust me, the last thing I am is sympathetic for the guy. You can't talk all that shit without at least expecting consequences from the people you are poking. That being said, for a man like Yockey, an examination was functionally a death sentence. He possessed information that the feds would kill to have access to, and any examinations he would receive would probably take the form of the funny boys in black demanding info on his connections with their boots on his neck. I can't blame the guy for being a little scared of this outcome. And with all of this context, what he did next makes a whole lot more sense. On June 17th, 1960, Francis Parker Yockey was found dead in his cell, having bit down on a cyanide pill. Nobody was ever able to figure out how he got it. You could make the argument that he was murdered, but I personally think otherwise. The 3-letter agencies would have loved to use him as a bank of information on both the far right, Cuba, and the Soviet Union, and I seriously doubt that they would just straight up murder a potential golden goose. What matters is that he was now very dead. His legacy would be continued by other figures among the far right, with Imperium being reprinted in 1962 for the first time since its original run. His ideas never really caught on in the US for fairly obvious reasons. He left a greater legacy in Europe and other places where the anti-nationalist fascism idea caught on a little more, and several political parties and organizations claim some degree of lineage from his ideas. His anti-Semitism and racism naturally also had influence, especially since he was the first major figure to deny the Holocaust and other such things. He also found a curious amount of influence in pagan movements, which surprises me more than it probably should, in all honesty. Other than that, though, he was somewhat left behind by the march of time. He is far less well known than some of the other louder far-right figures from the same time period, like Rockwell and Mosley. Although, I suppose, in a way, that was his ideal ending. Remembered but not mainstream. He never expected to be the mythical unifying figure that he describes in his work. He was just a theorist, an ideologue, a devil on the shoulder that simply asked what if. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.